So I started out as a professional ski racer on the European Cup and World Cup circuit. And the only way I could stay on the circuit was to find sponsors. And I soon came to the conclusion that I was a lot better at finding sponsors than winning any of the races. And as this was the beginning of the sports marketing industry back in the 70s, if you're fortunate enough to be at the beginning of an industry, you fairly quickly become sort of established and an expert in the field. And from that went on to the marketing of some of the world's major events. I spent more than 20 years as the director of the International Olympic Committee in charge of all of their business, marketing, television, and that was up until the 2004 Games in Athens. And then really decided it was time to sort of take on a new adventure, at which stage I formed my own strategic advisory group with a small select group of clients ranging from Bernie Ecclestone in Formula One and looking at the strategy and marketing to Formula One, through to, on the Olympic world, the political campaigns for London to win the Games and 4 years later for Rio to win the Games, and the related media rights and major sponsorship rights to those events. The Olympics is a very unique animal because it has this 100-year heritage. Some would argue 3,000-year heritage if you go back to ancient Greece. And you've got to, on the one hand, respect that heritage, but on the other, to see how can you continue, move with the times and come up with new thinking, innovation and ideas. The next London Games will be my 16th Olympic Games. And it is remarkable how each time, each host, each new organizing committee team is able to come up with new ideas, new thinking that really add to the Olympic brand, to the success and the staging of the Games. For me, I think perhaps some of the most special moments, and having been privileged to watch the greatest sport, was actually what happened outside of the venues. It was probably on the torch relay, where you listen to the truly inspirational stories of the community people who were running with the torch. And it was then that you really began to appreciate the true magic and power of the Olympic brand. The whole brand management of the Olympics came about probably in the late 90s after we had encountered some problems with the 96 Games in Atlanta, where it was felt that certain things that Atlanta and the Americans did were not in line with the Olympic image. Once you began to look at what is it that makes the Olympics special, what is it that makes it different, what does it stand for, in exactly the same way as any company would examine its profile and image, you began to understand its role from excellence, from unity, from celebrating humanity, from bringing the world together, from fair play. So part of our role back at the IOC at the time was to understand that, to then make sure you protected it, and to embark on programs or initiatives that would enhance those values. It's been interesting to see how business has been starting to understand or study sport, whether it is from team management, whether it is from motivation, whether you take it on one of the latest projects working with on Formula One, as to the speed and turnaround that they deliver innovation. What they do in 2 to 3 months takes 2 to 3 years in the auto industry. And so you have everything from production line to engineering coming and studying the work practices of Formula One to see how could they translate those or adapt those back into their organization. The best piece of career advice was probably back in the 90s when the IOC was going through a corruption scandal revolving around how Salt Lake City had been elected. And for many months, the scandal and media focus was so great that you didn't know whether the organization would survive the day. I mean, it was a brutal global meltdown. And at the time, my key responsibility was to keep all the corporations on board, because if they started to step out, it was game over. And I was shuttling backwards and forwards to the US, meeting the various CEOs of our partners. And the best advice, and it came from 2 or 3 of the CEOs, was say, you know what, in a crisis, the real measure of an organization and the measure of an individual is whether you can turn that crisis around to your advantage. Whether you're actually just going to paper over the cracks, or whether you will use it as a catalyst to really address things in the organization that you'd wanted to do, but couldn't. And at the time, the crisis was brutal. But we probably ended up putting 30 years of reform and restructuring into 6 months, which under any other circumstances you wouldn't have been. And so it was that single advice of use the crisis to your advantage.